welcome everybody. I know people will gradually trickle or maybe even flood in. So welcome to this webinar on Disinformation's Golden Moment, Challenges and Responses in the COVID-19 Era, held, I'm glad to say, jointly between the Chatham House Russia and Eurasia program, that so many of you know and love, and the Jamestown Foundation. And I'll hand over to my co-chair and friend, Glenn Howard, Jamestown president, in a second to say a few words and to introduce the three excellent speakers. But let me just say a word about this being jointly held, because first of all, I'm sure many of you will agree, whether you've come to this from Chatham House and Jamestown, but Jamestown is, with its Eurasia Daily Monitor in particular, is an invaluable source of information. So it's a real pleasure to be doing this with you, Glenn, and John over there on the other side of the pond. This is also a force multiplier, because I think combining our resources, our databases, our key stakeholders, we've got about 200 of Chatham House's clients, if you like, and about 200 of Jamestown's. So this is quite a fresh audience from each other's side of the Atlantic, if you will. And obviously we'll have people coming in from all around the world as well. Now, a few more admin points, if I may, before I hand over to Glenn and then to the speakers. First of all, this being such a large meeting of 400 or so, we are on the record. Doesn't make much sense using the Chatham House rule today. In fact, we'll make a full recording of it, and Glenn and I will discuss afterwards how we might release it onto YouTube, or parts of it are embedded into our respective websites. The plan is a fairly regular one. People will be familiar with the format. The speakers will present for about 10 minutes each. Then we'll proceed to Q&A. Now, if you have questions, many of you will be familiar with this already, you can do this in two ways, really. Either type them into the Q&A section, which you can see at the bottom of your screen, or you're free to ask a question yourself. We will unmute you. You're muted right now. And if there's a section where you can raise your hand electronically in the participants tab at the bottom of the screen, and we'll just ask your question vocally, although not visually. I don't think we can put you on screen. So ask your question live or put it in chat and I will ask it for you. And if those questions can be upvoted. It's quite a democracy here on Zoom, whereby if you really like a question, you can say that you like it, much as you do on Facebook, and I will see that you like it. And if lots of people like it, I'll see that it's an important question, and it will get it'll get priority, if you like, or at least I'll take a lot more notice of it. But I'll try and get as many in as possible over the course of the hour, because we'll have, approximately speaking, we're talking about 30 minutes from the speakers and another hour of questions and discussion. Final thing to say, before I hand over to Glenn, is that while disinformation is not, of course, particular to Russia, I think it's reasonable to say that Russia is a kind of a leading practitioner, an expert in the field, if you like, and we will be concentrating on Russia. The speakers are all Russia experts, and of course, similarities and differences can be drawn with China, and I'm sure they will be over the next hour and a half, I'm sorry. But the majority of the webinar will look at Russia and be careful not to delve too closely into questions on China. So with that, just to thank you all for attending from your respective homes, I presume, and I will rejoin you in the Q&A in approximately half an hour. Glenn, welcome. Great to do this with you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, James. It's a great pleasure to be co-hosting this event today with Chatham House. It's the first time that Jamestown has done something like this online, and we're delighted that our first partner is, of course, Chatham House. And we appreciate the fact that Thomas Kent has put us in touch with you and helped make a lot of this possible to bring these distinguished guests to you today. I think that it's exactly right that this is a very timely topic. Many of the people that would be speaking today are experts in the areas of disinformation and the specific topics that they cover. So there's a lot of depth and coverage and perspective that the presenters today will be giving to each of the persons in our discussion. Now, the title of our event today is Russia's Disinformation Golden Moment, Challenges and Responses in the COVID Era. I think that this is a really extremely important topic to look at because we see so much discussion now on the COVID crisis in Europe. There's certainly an urgency to kind of continue to examining this underlying issue. Now, each of the persons that we have today I know several of them firsthand, and I do think that many we're going to start off with their various perspectives. Now, the first speaker will be Keir Giles, who's a senior consulting fellow in Russia Eurasia program at Chatham House. Keir is a well-known expert on information warfare. He's written several books and very, very prolific writer on all these issues. Now, the next speaker after him will be Thomas Kent. Tom is a senior fellow at Jamestown Foundation. He's also adjunct associate professor at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. And last but not least, he's the former president and CEO of RFE-RL. So Tom is going to be talking today about the counter trends that Russian disinformation has to contest with independent journalism and the overall world democracy movement and how to strengthen them. He's also putting the finishing touches on a book that he's going to be coming out with later this summer with the help of the Jamestown Foundation. So we appreciate if everyone stay tuned to that. Our last speaker will be Anneli Ahonen. She is the head of the StratCom task force. She's a part of the External Action Service for the European Union. She has also been in the front lines as a former journalist living in St. Petersburg, where she worked for several years. She now resides in Brussels, and where she plays a key role in fending off unwanted trolls circling Brussels. So Keir, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Each person will have 10 minutes, and then we'll circle back to the next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn, and good afternoon, everybody. There's a reason why this event has been called Russian Disinformation's Golden Moment, and that is because at the moment we're facing a perfect storm of three different elements which actually create a unique opportunity for malign actors during this pandemic. First, there's fear and uncertainty and doubt, which is natural rather than being engineered. There's a lack of certainty in what are the correct responses to the current situation. There's speculation and competing theories and recommendations, and that lack of certainty allows malign actors to step in with strong theories. Second, there's a greater vulnerability now of societies because of that reduced social interaction between them when they're sitting on lockdown. And third, despite what James said about our focus on Russia today, there's now disinformation coming from so many different malign actors, not just Russia, that foreign and domestic adversaries seeking to subvert society and governance all over are actually now leading to real-life strategic effects. And the most obvious case in point is this sudden and spectacular collapse of the global authority and standing of the United States. But let me take each of those in turn. We've long been worried about the idea of the decline of the notion of objective truth and the problem when populations can no longer discern expertise and truth when they're presented with it. Well, that's now exacerbated and accelerated because expertise itself is divided. Nobody knows the full truth about what should or should not be done about the pandemic. So we're coming close to that situation when truth no longer matters, and what populations are told incessantly and insistently by malign actors is the only thing that they're going to believe. And you see examples of that across the world, whether it's the link between 5G and coronavirus in Europe, or if it's in North America, the denial of coronavirus science. These theories take hold because disinformation always works best in a vacuum, when there are no competing messages or when the competing messengers, the authentic messengers, inspire no trust in themselves to start with. So now we have a combination of that lack of trust and an artificial vacuum, which has been exacerbated in countries that are under lockdown by this increased retreat to online worlds, where you have people living large parts of their lives in virtual realities where they can be influenced more effectively, going along with these reductions in human interaction and the associated reality checks that go with that when you discuss things with real people face to face. So there's been a process of filter bubbles and echo chambers becoming more perfect and narratives becoming more ingrained despite of their detachment from reality. And there are so many adversaries that are riding domestic dysfunction, but also actors at home exerting malign influence on society and government in their own countries for their own political ends. So those of us that are just monitoring external influence, external malign campaigns to subvert and disrupt, need to evolve and also to consider these self-inflicted injuries, especially the ones that even in strong democracies have the power to inflict grievous bodily harm. And it's not just the conspiracy theorists that have always been there. Now we need also to deal with authority figures who are acting as the toxic super spreaders of misinformation or disinformation directed against their own populations. And this multiplication of threat actors is creating this even more complex environment to deal with. It's a whole of society threat, and as always, it's needed a whole of society holistic response. But even before the pandemic, we were behind the curve in providing that response, because all of those organizations that are still keeping a close focus on direct falsification by Russian state media or Russian state organizations, while neglecting the broader disinformation ecosystem, are needing to catch up now, a long way from behind. In particular, it's other elements of subversion or destabilization, like agents of influence, like useful idiots, and others who consciously or unconsciously promote and disseminate Russian agendas that are harmful to our security. And that's media, academics, think tanks, politics. Australia, for example, has a counter foreign interference task force, which tries to take that holistic approach and explicitly considers democratic institutions, education and research, media and communications, and much more. They have a foreign interference threat assessment center and funding to support criminal prosecutions for foreign interference under new legislation that has been passed. And you have to ask yourself the question, why is it that every country that is facing a similar threat does not have a similar setup to deal with it? In the future, it may get rapidly worse, and that's because new technologies that are coming online will allow disinformation campaigns to be massively scaled up because they are even less reliant on humans. Malign influence campaigns leveraging cyber capabilities have caused immense political disruption, of course, already in the United States and elsewhere. But the next generation of campaigns could be considerably more damaging by adopting machine learning for far greater automation and scaling. Now, the current methods for waging these campaigns successfully depend on labor-intensive human interaction with targets sometimes. During the early 2010s, a successful disinformation campaign needed humans at every stage. The concept needed to be developed and the material needed to be designed and drafted and generated and then spread through social media platforms, online fora, etc. And dissemination needed the use of social media profiles which had to be created in advance of the campaign, often manually, and then serviced by humans in order to build social networks, generate followers, and establish that credibility. But the introduction of machine learning and potentially later artificial intelligence will enormously enhance capabilities for automating that reaching of mass audiences with tailored and plausible content, and that is going to render malicious actors even more powerful. That's even before we get onto the whole subtopic of deepfakes, which, if you have an interest in deepfakes, I would strongly recommend checking out a conversation that was had yesterday with NATO's Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in Riga, available online, discussing exactly where deepfakes are likely to be a serious problem and where they are not. But that question, of course, applies to the whole of disinformation campaigns. We still need to be aware that observing these campaigns has to include successful identification of where they do and where they do not have the potential to do any real damage, in order to arrive at that fine balance between overreacting to Russian disinformation efforts and not reacting to them at all. But it's no longer 2015 and 2016, where we were intently focused on trying to work out how effective they are in changing the minds and the behaviors of the populations that they were aimed at, because the situation into which this disinformation is being projected has changed beyond all recognition. Russia and China are now both positioning themselves as responsible actors with an aspiration to replace the United States in global leadership. They're positioning themselves for after the pandemic, when they may be able to translate influence into strategic advantage. Both of them are chipping away at subsets of populations, presenting Russia and China as being helpful, not disruptive. It's one area where their local and their global narratives coincide, and they're consistent, trying to convince the world that Russia is not a threat, and maybe, in fact, Russian influence is benign. In order to do so, they are riding this perfect storm. They don't need to try and invent narratives of a dysfunctional, declining United States, because the current United States administration is doing such an excellent job of that itself. They don't need to portray the EU as being ineffective and uninterested in the fate of its citizens and its member states, when the EU is functioning in a strategic communications vacuum and not actually publicizing what it is doing for those member states. And positive narratives and truthful communications that are directed at our own populations and at third countries are obscured in the background noise of this huge emergency that we're all facing. And the result of all of this has been a spectacular reversal in an astonishingly short time. where the uppermost echelons of leadership in the United States are now in the same position facing publics worldwide as the Kremlin. Because even when they tell the truth, trust in them is already so deeply eroded that the default assumption is that they are not. We can break this down to very simple examples and very simple issues and questions of who exactly can we trust. Take, for instance, the delivery of medical equipment from Russia to New York just over a month ago, where the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the US State Department can't agree between themselves on who paid for it all. Now, in other times, very, very recently, we would have assumed by default that the United States was telling the truth. But now that trust has been so fatally eroded that even when you dig deeper into it, you simply don't know. And as I say, that is a spectacular reversal of the normal burdens of assumption. Similarly, with the EU, when it appears to put political pressure on the counter-disinformation defenders. Now, Anneli will come along later and probably cannot talk about StratCom East and Chinese disinformation, but perhaps the situations that are already not still ongoing, other friendly fire incidents, are something that she can talk about in the context of challenges to her mission. And speaking of challenges, we always assumed that the challenge to US global leadership might come in some form of military confrontation with an actor growing stronger. Instead, what we've seen is disinformation from all possible angles, having that strategic effect and creating a vacuum of leadership into which others are queuing up to step when the time is right. Now, I'm going to pass the baton over to Tom Kent now. Everything that I say about this topic generally tends to be extremely depressing, but Tom has spent a year compiling information from around Europe and the United States to write a book, and he's come up with some generally more cheery conclusions. So the antidote to my pessimism is going to come up now in the form of Tom Kent. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Keir. I can't promise to deliver cheer, but I will make somewhat of an effort. And hello, everyone from New York City. Keir has laid out a very persuasive description of how disinformation from Russian and other sources has battered scientific and political authority and even rational thinking. But if there's one thing that COVID teaches us, it's that the world is a pretty unpredictable place. Something we don't anticipate always happens. So I thought we might just imagine that the disinformation onslaught we're seeing turns out not to be as overwhelming or long-lasting as we currently fear. That Russian information's golden moment does not lead to a golden future for the Kremlin. Let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that, say, 5 years from now, major democracies are still right here, and that a number of smaller democracies, now in such peril from Russian efforts, manage to right themselves and survive as democratic states. And since supposing doesn't cost anything, let's conjure up some counterintuitive future for Russia too. Maybe someone besides Vladimir Putin will be running the country in 2025. Or Putin will remain in power, but with Russia being, for some reason, less aggressive and less adventurous than it is now. And I'm not guaranteeing or even predicting that this will occur, but if any of it happens to, we'll be looking back from 2025 on the world we're living in now to see what might have led to this happier outcome. Were there trends we were not sufficiently appreciating back in 2020, amid COVID and everything else, that wound up slowing the march of disinformation and authoritarian rule? I thought I'd venture to mention a few tendencies we see today that could fall into that category. These tendencies may be very weak. Still, they may deserve attention from those hoping to push things in a somewhat more positive direction. Perhaps they could serve as something of a counterweight to the very distressing picture that Keir has quite reasonably painted. So the first subject has to be COVID. The level of disinformation and conspiracy narratives is daunting. That said, I'm not sure we have the experience to be able to fully predict its impact. There's a really good study last week in the Eurasian Daily Monitor by Ksenia Kirillova. She noticed a widespread belief now in Russia that COVID is the result of a Western conspiracy, a belief fueled by the Russian disinformation machine. At the same time, she noted that citizens' faith in Russian state institutions has eroded. People are increasingly resistant to the lockdowns in Russia. They think they're a pretext for repression and profiteering. Some people even think Putin is an agent of a Western conspiracy. So the Russian disinformation machine was effective in spreading conspiracy theories, but not so much in accomplishing the more important outcome it was presumably aimed at, which was rallying Russians around the government and Putin himself. In the same vein, it's hard to say what the ultimate effect of disinformation in East Europe will be. It certainly should help obscurantist, conspiracy-minded forces in general. Whether it will make Putin look better to East Europeans than he does to Russia's own population is hard to gauge. EU StratCom has been reporting for a couple of weeks now that Russian disinformation organs are actually talking less about coronavirus. Maybe they're finding it's not the killer app of disinformation. We're also starting to see some indications that people in East Europe are actually turning a little bit more to reliable mainstream news outlets. Conspiracy sites are good places to go if you like blaming COVID on the Illuminati. But if you want to know what's actually happening with the pandemic in your city today, there seems to be a bit of a trend toward people looking to legitimate media. Now, certainly the massive disinformation around COVID is a test for young democratic governments, but it's also a test for illiberal ones, for authoritarian leaders. Stirring up resentment and fake news can win an election, but it can't deliver medical care or protect an economy. Failures can't be blamed endlessly on outside forces. Sooner or later, people will judge how their own government has performed. That performance could depend more on the organization and resources that the government brings to the fight, things citizens can concretely see, than the disinformation they're reading on their phones. This process of people judging their governments, often quite severely, has been going on with increasing momentum. It's hard to remember anything before COVID, but we have just gone through a year of worldwide protests against corruption and authoritarianism in Lebanon, Chile, Serbia, Sudan, Iraq, country after country. A lot of it is outside Eurasia, but it's all of a piece. Say what you will about the decline of democracy, but the idea that countries should have elections, hardly a fixture of human history, seems pretty universal these days. Elections can be fixed, they can yield an unfortunate result, but they don't always turn out negatively. Over the past year in Central Europe, we've seen elections in Slovakia and Romania and Poland that have arguably strengthened pro-Western tendencies, or at least created some parliamentary space to make policies that might be more progressive or more inclusive. This despite intense propaganda efforts by Russia and its allies. We will see how things work out for repressive rulers as COVID takes a long, grinding toll on populations and economies. Certainly, authoritarianism has gained some ground in recent years, but a good part of this advance has been built on muzzling opposition forces, stifling independent media, spreading disinformation, deploying surveillance technology, and manipulating the internet. These don't feel like the kinds of things governments do when they think they have popular support. History these days moves pretty fast, with populations increasingly connected, entrepreneurial, and educated. You have to wonder whether in the medium to long term, all this repression and disinformation is, as they say in Russian, perspektivny. Let's turn specifically to Russia, which is always stable until it's not. It's hard to make a convincing case that Putin's days in power are numbered. If he eventually gets his constitutional amendments through, he could rule till he's 84 years old, which makes Joe Biden seem positively young. Putin seems well protected by a solid police apparatus, a government beholden to him personally, and by colossal business interests dependent on his patronage. But if we're talking about trends, the trend in Russia has been for people to be more dissatisfied with the economy, more interested in improving relations with the West, and less enamored of Putin personally. There's a trend toward growing civil activism. It's against that background that Putin is trying to navigate through the oil price crash and economic sanctions and all his other problems, including COVID. Facing all this, you could imagine him launching some new foreign adventure. You could also imagine, at one point between now and 2025, some constellation of powerful people in Russia deciding that the country, and they personally, have gotten pretty much all the benefit they can from the country's present course. And it might make sense to be less aggressive internationally, maybe even with some changes at the top. nothing personal, just business. To wrap up, what have we here in terms of potentially hopeful trends? Disinformation is now a leading topic on the world agenda. People are aware of it. To capitalize on this, one might propose really massive assistance to reliable media, far more than the usual small, short-term grants they get. Civil society is a growing force. It also needs more scale. Civil society groups have to get out of the urban intellectual bubble that many of them inhabit. One could facilitate that. We might also encourage groups like those in France and Slovakia that are working to defund conspiracy and hate sites by urging companies not to allow their ads to appear on them. There are other possibilities to advance positive trends, but I'll stop here. I will acknowledge that positive trends are fragile shoots indeed, and the power of repression and disinformation is extraordinarily daunting. So I will hand over at this point to Anneli for her thoughts.
Thank you very much, Tom, and it's great to be in this honorable company today. Let me just start with briefly going through like a bit backwards from the beginning of this year, what we have seen and detected and analyzed during this period. So as mentioned, I work in the StratCom task force. We work to address Russia's disinformation through three different strands. Proactive communication in countries, in the Eastern Partnership countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan. Support to independent media, and then directly addressing disinformation. And there we run a website called EU versus Disinfo, monitor, expose pro-Kremlin disinformation. So what we started seeing in late January was that in a way coronavirus became a topic for pro-Kremlin disinformation outlets. So in a way it was expected that they quite organically jump into any kind of crisis like this to start exploiting it with the aim to divide societies, to spread conspiracy theories and so on. And then that was the first moment when the messages like that coronavirus was created in a secret US military lab started appearing both for the international audiences and for the domestic Russian ones. And this is something that builds on messages and narratives and stories that have been spreading in different countries, different regions already for years. So this is in a way also what Keir was saying, that the whole information environment is so changed that it already supports this type of disinformation efforts. Now, when the COVID crisis developed, and also the understanding how it will affect and impact us in Europe, also the tactics changed. So the propaganda tricks like aid to Italy were supported by very traditional propaganda, and at the same time pushing messages like this will mean Europe's like death of Europe, Schengen will collapse, and so on. And then, interestingly enough, as the COVID-19 crisis awareness became more prevalent inside Russia, there was a change and shift in these, for example, in the messages that would undermine the pandemic or claim that it's a hoax. There is no pandemic. There are no such things as death from coronavirus. And this, I think, is interesting for today's discussion because in a way that shows that traditional disinformation campaign, like for example around Crimea, MH17, Salisbury attacks, Skripal poisoning, which have traditionally supported Russia's own efforts and also the Kremlin's policies towards domestic audiences, now all of a sudden started backfiring. So in a way, I think it's interesting to see what the wider strategy will be. One aspect still to highlight is that the way how social media companies have reacted to coronavirus is significantly different than it has been to any disinformation or information operations around elections. So clearly there is more readiness to react to health-related misinformation and disinformation. And one example which might be interesting, I think, is Facebook's takedown this week of two Russian outlets, Newsfront and Southfront, which are outlets that we have been following for years. They operate in several languages, several audiences, constantly spread disinformation, and then jumped into this coronavirus topic as well. Southfront was trying to hide its links to Russia. We managed to expose that connection through video metadata on that website. And now finally Facebook took action, took down their accounts based on Facebook's own policies that these accounts were supported by fake accounts, and this violates Facebook policies. But I think it is an interesting, like one example, how these responses are also now changing. In a way, something that was impossible still some time ago is now happening, and it will shape also the whole way in which we are all coordinating our responses. So I think we are living interesting times, because in a way all the elements in our response, like supporting independent media or civil society, are now also becoming, I mean, the coronavirus has also had a really bad impact on, for example, media, how media is able to do normal job. So that's part, in a way, in our coordinated response is needs a lot more support in the future. And now I would like to hand over to Glenn or James and stop here and follow up later. Thank you.
Thank you, Anneli. Yes, to me, absolutely for a second, but Glenn, please pitch in if you need to. First of all, thank you to all three speakers for really sublime and very fluent, intelligent presentations, which I am sure already are getting a lot of questions. While I begin to collate those, partly based upon your voting for them, I will take a counter if you like them in the chat room. As I say, it's a democracy combined with sort of chair's prerogative. Whilst I do that, I might just ask each of you a question, perhaps in the order in which you spoke. So Keir, you mentioned that there was a fine line between overreacting to Russian disinformation and not reacting at all. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit more, please. I mean, first of all, I understand what obviously not reacting at all means. What does overreacting look like? And how do you find that line which is so difficult, as you conceded, to navigate? Tom, Keir correctly predicted your relative optimism. And I accept, of course, that authoritarian regimes are very much challenged by this, just as democracies are. So I sort of see what you're saying, that capabilities are less right now for authoritarian regimes, but I don't fully understand, perhaps you could again elaborate, how their ambition is less. They will surely still try things, if you like. And for Anneli, I suppose, I mean, I was slightly struck, I suppose, by a slight contradiction between your there's a slight disagreement, I suppose, between yourself and Tom in a way. I don't mean to encourage disagreement, but this is a perfectly reasonable place for it. Chatham House and Jamestown, we're all it's an open platform. But Tom had mentioned that the disinformation organs are talking less about coronavirus. I think that's what you said, Tom. So the question is to Anneli, really. I mean, that is not my understanding. You have noticed, this is sort of a factual question, have you noticed an actual increase in Russian disinformation around coronavirus? You said you've got more work than ever, it's harder than ever to do your work. I think you're sort of implying it would be good to have more resources right now. So there's a slight disagreement with Tom there. And that combines with a question we've already had, actually. I forget whose it is. I'll look it up in a second. Might have been David Heath's, which was, have you noticed any real-world effects of Russia's COVID-19 disinformation? So that's a question to each of you in order, if I may, starting with Keir, whilst everybody else continues to type in with questions or vote on questions already asked. Keir.
Thanks, James. Well, yes, your first question and your last one are actually tied very closely together, because finding that balance, finding how exactly to react to Russian disinformation and when to react to it, is all about the question of when it is actually having an effect. Mm-hmm. And that's the metrics that for so long were absent from this whole conversation. People could observe disinformation happening. They could see who was doing it. They could even see who was looking at it. But the big question, the big missing information, was whether it was actually having the power to change opinions, to change behaviors, whether it was meeting its objectives even when you knew what those objectives were. And without that key information, you can't calibrate a response, because you could throw unlimited resources at tracking disinformation and trying to rebut it all. But that would be pointless if some of it is actually having no effect whatsoever. If it's falling flat, there's no point in focusing resources and clever people on dealing with it. And that's where the balance comes in. That's where finding the golden medium between not doing enough about it and allowing it to cause harm to your society, and overreacting massively, which tends to inflate the problem and in some ways serve Russian objectives simply by pretending that they are more powerful than they actually are. So the key missing thing is exactly what you said about your last question, finding out where it is having an effect. And that's the measurement that has been lacking from this whole conversation throughout the whole period since disinformation became fashionable again after 2014. Tom?
Understood. Thank you very much, Tom.
Hi. I think in response to your question, the ambition will not be less on the part of Russia and other authoritarian forces and disinformation forces. They'll continue to strengthen themselves, including using some of the artificial intelligence techniques that Keir talked about. I think that disinformation will be increasingly personalized, and through artificial intelligence and other means, we will see disinformation crafted individually for us on the basis of the kinds of things that we are posting on social networks. There can be analysis done that will customize disinformation. On the positive side in all of this, I would say there's this. I mean, Keir is right that the credibility of the United States and the EU has gone down substantially, and these are major forces that are sort of hors de combat for the moment. At the same time, the genie is kind of out of the bottle. The genie of people demanding reasonable government and decent government and democracy to some degree. I don't think that you absolutely need outside engines to quite the degree you did before. When people in Chile or Serbia agitate for democracy, they're not doing it because they love democracy in the United States or the EU. They love democracy. They love what democracy could do for them in their own country. And so I think that to a degree, there's this army of people in their own countries understanding what decent government means, particularly strengthened by civil society, that helps even as authoritarians try to, as you said, increase their operations.
Thank you. Over to you, Anneli.
Thank you. as much as I would like to now pick up a fight with Tom, I'm afraid that maybe it was just my, Finnish English expression here, but I maybe didn't really manage to make my point through. So I think, like, on the question of a decrease in Russia's disinformation, I think it's really, really hard to calculate disinformation and to have it like on the scale of that you measure it in when it's increasing and when it's decreasing. So what we can say is that there are clear signs of pro-Kremlin actors like creating a certain distance between disinformation attempts and them. So we have a Russian senator that falsely tweeted that Poland had closed its airspace for the Russian aid to arrive to Italy. And when this appeared to be false, he also deleted that tweet, right? These kind of signs, like pro-Kremlin outlets operating in English, deleting their COVID section from their website. These type of things are happening, and as well on Russian TV, state TV, for the domestic audience, like downplaying the pandemic. These type of messages are not that relevant anymore. And then on the on the funding side, what I was actually trying to do was to call more funding for the independent media, which is right now suffering. So what I meant was, in a way, that all, like, different pieces in the whole of society response are now suffering in different ways, and this a long-term solution in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anneli. Before I come to my co-chair, in fact, to ask a question in person, if you like, I'm just going to actually read out David Heath's question, which I referred to in my own question, because there's a bit more to it than I generalised on. So David asks, probably to Keir and to Anneli, I'd be very interested to hear panelists' views on the real-world impact of COVID-19. That was my question. Fine. And he asks, clearly there's activity, but how successful has it been? And, crucially, what metrics can we use to assess this influence? So what other measurements by which we know, how do we know where, when, and by how much Russia has had a genuine influence on, if you like, Western liberal democracies? Maybe start here.
Certainly, yes. There are two main themes that the people like me have been pushing ever since the West woke up to the power of Russian information warfare shortly after Crimea. One is measuring the problem, and the other is social awareness. In a way, they overlap. But the problem of not knowing what the effect is, as I mentioned a moment ago, absolutely fundamental, because otherwise you are simply observing the problem. You're admiring it. You're not actually tackling it unless you register precisely what impact, what effect it's damaging, what damage it is having. Because if Russia is going to expend a lot of energy and a lot of resources throwing disinformation out into the void with no effect, then please, by all means, carry on. But the specific question is about how exactly do you measure it? There have been a lot of different suggestions about how exactly you could measure that impact. The problem is none of them are easy. All of them cost money, and this is one of the key reasons why none of them have been visibly implemented in Western societies. There may be something happening on a subsurface level that doesn't come through and be visible to us in open sources, but certainly there's been no visible, coordinated effort in tracking Russian disinformation. The result is that it is haphazard and it's anecdotal. So we have examples going back over the last 6 years where a statement by a politician or a decision is based on information which, if you trace it back, you can find originally it came from Russian state media or from a Russian disinformation outlet. But those are isolated instances, and it is incredibly labor intensive to track that process back for each of these pieces of information. In terms of a broader scale of what kind of impact is being had, suggestions have included rapid micropolling, focus groups, bringing in volunteers to assess with them, here is a piece of information of which you're aware, where do you think it came from? And discovering the extent to which disinformation has masked its sourcing trail back to the original Russian source. Now, the prototype for this that is often put forward was mass observation, which was a program in the United Kingdom running up until the 1950s, which did precisely this sampling of opinion and reporting on daily life and attitudes among the population in very granular detail in order to track precisely this kind of problem. How rumors, how disinformation, how real information was spreading among the population and what effect it was having. But as I said a moment ago, unfortunately, that costs. So what is needed is an assessment, first of all, of whether Western governments are actually prepared to take this threat seriously enough to invest the resources in it, something that, as Anneli alluded to a moment ago, we certainly have not seen in the case of the EU.
Thank you, Keir. Tom or Anneli, would you like to come in on this? I mean, it's related actually, Tom, linking you to a question asked by Julie Newton, which is you mentioned the public opinion in Russia may not be buying into state disinformation about COVID. Do you have anything to back that up yourself? It's a sort of a related question. So just before I hand over to Glenn, Tom or Anneli?
Well, Anneli, you go ahead since it was originally for you, and I'll be glad to add something.
Thank you. So after Keir's extensive elaboration, I would just like to add that there are some examples of these surveys, pollings that have conducted in different countries, clearly showing that, for example, these aid missions of Russia and China have worked towards the population, which believes that more than before that it is Russia and China that are supporting and maybe not EU, which might be the case in fact. And then also some of the studies that suggest that, for example, if a person believes that coronavirus pandemic is a hoax, this person is then also less likely to follow the instruction of the health authorities. So when this pro-Kremlin disinformation is related to health directly, like spreading messages about false fake cures, or downplaying the pandemic itself, or, for example, suggesting that hand washing doesn't help, is not helpful. Here, I think that as much as I would also like to want to wait for for extensive research on this, I think that through these examples we can still have some kind of understanding that, especially when it comes to health-related issues, there clearly is an impact, and then we have to wait some years and years before we have the comprehensive picture of what is actually happening right now in front of our own eyes. Thank you.
Thanks, Anneli. Over to Tom.
One problem with metrics on Russian disinformation is that it's very hard to tell exactly what came from Russia. If you look at Italy, for example, there was a SWG poll there within the past month or so that had all these startling conclusions about how Italians now regard China as their greatest friend and Russia as their second greatest friend, and they consider the United States to be an enemy, and also Germany as an enemy, and so forth. Well, this follows a lot of very intense Russian disinformation and the arrival of the 9 planes from Moscow with masks for Italians and so forth. But at the same time, the Italians have all sorts of reasons not to like the EU and suspicion of the United States and so forth. Mm-hmm. So to say that, aha, the Russians did this may be giving them too much credit.
Thanks, Tom. So just to say, we're 45 minutes in with 45 minutes to go. We've got about 16 or 17 questions. Nobody has actually yet raised their electronic hands, which you can do in the participants tab at the bottom of your screens. You can't do it physically because you can see us, but we can't see you. So please do that. In the meantime, I promised long ago to go to my co-chair, Glenn Howard. You're unmuted, Glenn. Over to you.
Yes. Thank you, James. I wanted to go back to something that Keir had said and Tom, and I would like Anneli to weigh in. When we're assessing the responses of governments to this issue, it's been a great debate inside the United States, and Tom is kind of addressing this, and Keir has kind of hinted at it and knows what's going on inside the UK. But it particularly concerns the government administrative structure for responding to disinformation. Now, Keir had indicated that something very interesting a while ago. He said mentioned a deep fake early warning detection system. Now, that's a very interesting and fascinating thing if you can get it administratively within the US government and other foreign governments to understand when something is occurring. And so I'd like to, the United States has tried to create something called the Global Engagement Center. It's being assessed, evaluated, criticized as an institution receiving a massive amount of US funding, but people are questioning about what is it really doing. And Tom has been looking at that quite extensively, administratively within the United States. Keir, you had said something very interesting that I'd like you to just kind of touch upon, and if you don't feel comfortable about the UK response, but I certainly am interested in how Australia is dealing with this. And Anneli, please, if you have a comment about, obviously you can't talk about EU policy, but you certainly are frustrated with too about how EU has kind of assessed and tried to deal with this. But if you want to weigh in on that, please do. So Keir, I'll turn it over to you, and then Tom, you can respond, and followed by Anneli.
Yeah, certainly. Each country has some form of response, but the difference in between each of these countries is in every single way of measuring them. How visible where they are versus how covert, how well-funded and well-resourced as opposed to working on a shoestring, and even their attitude to cooperation and sharing information is totally different. In the UK, there is a division of the Foreign Office called CDND, Counter Disinformation and Media Development, which does exactly what it says on the tin. It is looking at how to counter means of disinformation and also strengthening independent media, because, as Tom suggested, this is one of the key means of doing so. But there are different emphases for how each of these organizations actually go about their business. And the reason why I highlighted the Australian model is because it explicitly includes all of the different vectors through which disinformation and malignant influence might actually be delivered. So it's not focusing just on direct falsifications on RT, which so often is the bright, shiny object that distracts everybody from what's going on through other means of delivering disinformation. It's actually looking across the board at all of the ways in which influence is delivered against healthy democracies. That is less visible in many other countries. I'll leave comment on the GEC in the United States to Tom, because he has been looking much more closely at it. Apart from flagging one particular thing, which stands out for us as a big question mark of what exactly they're doing. Well, part of their mission is bringing together these disparate organizations and groups, and sometimes individuals from across different countries that have been tracking and dealing with disinformation and trying to pool and share their efforts. But at the same time, the GEC seems strangely secretive about what exactly it is doing, and has referred to, quote, tradecraft, unquote, in terms of uncovering disinformation. Hopefully, Tom, you can dig a little bit better into that and find out the motivations for it, because there's a strange contradiction between, on the one hand, trying to bring everybody's efforts together and raise awareness, and on the other, being very selective about what you'll share in public, which I'm sure is probably a problem that Anneli herself has grappled with. How much exactly do you share overtly? But put it all together, and you've got a situation still, even after all of these years, where so many different actors are trying to work against this common problem, but it's extremely hard for them to talk to each other, because the networks, the organizations, the uniting bodies that would actually bring all of those efforts together, remove duplication of efforts, share best practice, and create a shared common picture of what is going on, seems to have been so absent for so long. Tom, I know that you, when you have been doing the research for your book, have come up with some slightly different conclusions because you did see positive signs of all of these different groups, whether governmental, NGOs, or private citizens, were actually being enabled to share what they were doing with each other. And maybe you can talk about that for a moment.
Sure, I'll start with a couple negative signs, and that is that so far there's no one that I can identify in the U.S. government, particularly at the level of the National Security Council, where it would be, who is charged with fighting Russian disinformation, who takes it seriously, who is trying to organize any kind of all-of-government approach. It's not fashionable currently to be very high profile in the U.S. government with anti-Russian efforts. You can do anti-China efforts, you can do anti-Iran efforts, but for reasons I think we can all imagine, carrying the anti-Russian flag is just not that popular at the moment in the American government bureaucracy. As for the Global Engagement Center, it has a couple issues. One is that given the overall scene with Russian disinformation in the U.S. government, I think that they're kind of torn between whether their job is to be a public body or not. Congress wasn't really clear about that. Congress made clear that they were supposed to coordinate efforts to fight malign information from state actors, and they do a lot of coordinating among various civil society groups and so forth. But it's not clear that their job is to be the spokesman, to be the EU StratCom of the U.S. And as a result, it's very unclear. And there was testimony by the Global Engagement Center's director or coordinator a month or two ago before Congress, and she very effectively talked about disinformation in general, but didn't really want to get into any particular narratives that anyone was pushing. She said she didn't want to give them currency, and she didn't want to reveal their tradecraft. I mean, I don't think it takes much tradecraft to see what the Russians are doing in the information realm, but anyhow, it's a far cry from what went on during the Cold War with the U.S. Active Measures Information Group that was trying so hard to publicize falsehoods and forgeries that were promoted by Russia. The positive thing I'll say about the Global Engagement Center is that they have been very good in working with and funding a wide variety of civil society groups that are pushing back against disinformation by Russia and others. My personal view is that civil society is probably the best vehicle to combat disinformation in country after country after country. And sometimes the best thing a government can do is to support them. And that's what the GEC has done to a great extent.
Anneli, do you want to contribute to this? And it's a slightly naughty question to ask maybe whether you feel that the US needs a StratCom.
Well, I can explain how it functions on our side.
Mm-hmm.
So we have been StratCom addressing Russia's disinformation since 2015, and the mandate comes from all the EU members. So all the member states came together, European Council, and decided that the EU has to do something about Russia's disinformation. And this is where the moment when Europe and EU woke up as an institution on this topic. And since then, it has been the External Action Service, which has the mandate to address foreign disinformation from foreign actors. And then the Commission has the focus on social media platforms, potential future regulation, as well as the money to fund research, civil society, as well as independent media. So this is in a way the share of work, how it works on EU side, and then directly on Russia and pro-Kremlin sources. There, I think that what has been really important decision that was made already back then in 2015-16 was that we focus on public work, that there is public scrutiny on the results of our work, and these findings are available on EU versus Disinfo. And this creates also a mechanism where we can develop our methodology, we can develop our work to improve it, which otherwise, of course, would be somewhere behind the scenes without this public scrutiny. So I think even that, of course, creates the risk of criticism, which is not maybe that natural for any kind of institution. I think in the end, it has proven to be a good mechanism. And then when it comes to the coronavirus crisis, I think that in a way, when I look back what has happened with our team that received its first funding only a year and a half ago, which is now put into professional media monitoring and data analysis. So we were able to build this monitoring capacity before this crisis happened unacceptedly. So I think in a way that's the bright side of our response, that this was in place. At least this was in place, and now there is like a stress test on how we are able to function, and then we can, after some time, take the lessons learned, what we can learn and take out from all of this, because I think there will be plenty of work to done in the future.
Thanks, Anneli. Before I fulfill my promise to be democratic and go with some of the highest rated questions, I saw Mikhail Patashuri's on sanctions is highest, and I will ask that in a second. I actually just want to, because I'm trying to coalesce some related questions together, and as Australia's approach has been mentioned a couple of times now, then Matt Sussex, my friend down in Australia, has basically asked, should we focus on, when we're countering disinformation from Russia, should we focus on the message or the messenger? Maybe Anneli, let's go back to you this time very briefly.
Well, we have of course been focusing on the message, because it's in a way, as for a governmental institutional body, it would not be accepted if we would go after the messenger, after a certain individual, for example. Mm-hmm. But then I think this role falls clearly to the media and civil society part, who should keep accountable also the individuals who are responsible and behind disinformation campaigns.
Keir, is there any value in going after the messenger?
It's essential, because discrediting the messenger, once you can trace the information back to them, of course, discredits all of the messages at one go. Finding damaging misinformation and countering it and providing the alternative and the trustworthy source is absolutely essential. But that doesn't mean any more now than it did 5 years ago that we should be chasing down every single piece of disinformation and spending effort on rebutting it and debunking it and putting out a massive publicity campaign about it. We do need to make sure that it is identified in order to have this overall picture of what works. But let's not chase everything. And there's an excellent military analogy which also works in the field of strategic communications to point out exactly why this is the case. If you think back a couple of years to the anti-ISIS campaign in northern Iraq and the assault on Mosul, there was a leafleting campaign. Old-fashioned, old-school, chuck leaflets out of airplanes, blanket the area with lots and lots of propaganda leaflets. The value of this was found to be not so much that the message was reaching the civilian population, which might have been the original intent. Instead, what happened was the ISIS defenders were spending so much effort collecting up these leaflets, making sure that they did not fall into the hands of the civilian population, that they spent no time actually building the defenses of the city. And we risk being in the same position. If we try to track every single little piece of Russian disinformation and spend resources on it, then we're missing the bigger picture, and we're missing that pervasive, subversive campaign that actually seeks the long-term objectives against our society. But again, it comes back to that question you asked earlier of balance. It comes back to finding the medium response that in between ignoring it completely and chasing everything, there is that happy medium of actually working out what is a problem and dealing specifically with that.
Thanks, Keir. Tom, I'm keen to move on, but if you've got something to say, you're very welcome to say it.
No, I'm into what Keir says about the messenger.
Got it. So, as promised, Mikhail Patashuri asks a sanctions question. Russia is trying to use COVID-19 pandemic as a tool, he says, to reach the abolishment of sanctions against Russia. In several occasions, for example, UNESCAP in the media as well, Russia is arguing that unilateral sanctions against Russia is hindering the fight against COVID-19. Okay, but it's totally missing a point, surely, he says, because that's not why sanctions were introduced. So does anyone want to comment on the relevance of COVID-19 to the abolishment or otherwise, strengthening maybe, of sanctions? Let's go to Tom first, perhaps, because, well, the US is leading away on sanctions.
Well, the U.S. Is pushing forward still with sanctions, somewhat surprisingly, but yes, they are. And I think it's just basically a question of the Russians using sanctions, using COVID at the moment as the latest thing to push back sanctions. I really don't see the connection. I don't think the Russians have demonstrated a case that the problem is they would have to argue that their measures against COVID are such a failure that they must have aid from outside, and therefore sanctions must be dropped. And that's a hard hill for them to climb.
Got it. Anneli, have you noticed much on sanctions in your work in the last 6 weeks or so?
Not that much, actually. I don't. Or maybe I just don't right now recall it, but I don't really recognize this as part of our constant monitoring. But then of course there was the very interesting letter sent to a certain Italian political party asking exactly this question. So I think it's a relevant topic in any case.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Anneli's just put her finger on exactly the problem. This is a great illustration of why, if people are just focusing on media or even social media-based disinformation, you're missing the broader ecosystem. Because, yes, sanctions is one of those few examples where Russia actually has a positive objective that is clearly discernible, towards which information campaigns, strategic communications campaigns overall are actually leading, as opposed to the general subversion and destabilization and erosion of Western societies, which is a given if you take a zero-sum view of security, because if you weaken your adversary, then you, by comparison, are stronger. So in this case, we do see a very strong campaign trying to use the COVID excuse as a means for lifting sanctions, whether it's directly related to so-called green corridors for allowing specific equipment into Russia, even though it would be in breach of sanctions, or in general, we're all in this together, so why are we sanctioning each other? But it's not happening as part of a media campaign. Instead, it's outside. It's through different avenues. It's through diplomatic approaches. It's through letters to political party leaders. It's through outreach events like the deliveries of something or other to Italy that were mentioned before. All of those form a much broader campaign than what we typically, classically, think of as disinformation and the kind of thing that would be tracked by Anneli's outfit. And that's why it's so important to have that holistic view of the whole campaign across the board that I was referring to.
Very interesting point. Thank you very much, Keir. Right, to prove that the raise hand function works, Claudia Rossett, I think a Jamestown regular, I saw you first. We will unmute you.
Thank you, and thank you for this terrific presentation. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the coordination or any coordination between Russia and China, especially on the coronavirus. I believe I saw something coming out of China in around February blaming Russia for the virus. Was that potentially disinformation about disinformation, or what's going on there? Thank you.
Well, Claudia, thank you very much, because I was actually going to ask Maxine David's high-rated question next, and it's very much related. So if I just ask that as well, it'll cover the same ground. We seem to be seeing China and Russia working together in terms of disinformation. Slight contradiction there. Could you say a little bit more about whether this is something we were seeing prior to COVID-19, what the processes are here? Is this coordinated? If so, by whom, and using what forum? It's a trend we'd like to see continue. And does it expose both states' manipulation of information? Tom, perhaps.
Not my field of specialization. I can just say that that China, like many countries, is experimenting with different ways of becoming active and effective in the information space. I would recommend to any country that they not stake their success on spreading false narratives. I think China in the past has focused its efforts on good news about China and good news about China's relationships with other countries. And that is the means by which it's accomplished a lot in the information space so far.
There are two different ways in which you can take that question, whether it's talking about the methodology or the actual messages that are being delivered. And there are two slightly different answers for both of those. In terms of methodology, yes, for sure. China has looked at what Russia has been doing and reached the assessment that, yes, this works. We can do this as well because it is so effective, because Western liberal democracies have not set up defenses against this kind of techniques. But it's really important to remember that it is not just Russia and China doing this. There are lots of other actors around the world, both states and non-state actors, that are copying exactly these same techniques and these ways of, for example, manipulating social media platforms, not by exploiting them and going against their procedures, but actually designing the way they are built to target and triage and reach specific audiences. This has been learned as a successful technique, and so it has proliferated all across the world, and specifically also in terms of domestic internal politics. You have people undertaking the same kind of hostile campaigns against electorates that they've seen happen from outside the country. So it shouldn't be a surprise in that sense that we see a correlation between the methods that China is using, or rather an overlap between those methods and those of Russia. Of course, there are differences in detail, such as, for example, the way Russia and China deal with hostile criticism. It could be economic measures, or it could be accidentally falling out of a window. There are differences in style and approach. But overall, you can see why the two find that there is value in following these specific ways of reaching populations directly. And in terms of the message, again, it shouldn't be completely surprising that there is an overlap there as well. Yes, certainly they will have divergent interests in terms of who they want to blame for the virus. And for China, of course, it is one of the strong emphases is deflecting blame in order not to suffer consequences, which isn't so much of an incentive for Russia. But in terms of attempting to suggest that this is a US problem, that it was man-made, that it came from the United States one way or another, Fort Detrick, which features so heavily in all of these stories, again comes up in COVID disinformation. No surprises at all that those overlap. Whether there is actually coordination behind the scenes or not, unfortunately, is not something that we, working entirely from open sources as we do, would have any way of finding out.
Anneli, I'm keen to move on. I know you're slightly reluctant to talk about China, so is that fair? Yeah, you're muted, but I'll assume that's an agreement.
It's okay for me to talk about China.
Let me move on. I'd like to ask a question by Jamestown fellow Margarita Cienova. Margarita, it's nice to hear from you again. I'll read out your question more or less as is. It's very interesting. Right. We need to use more accurate terminology to describe state-run disinformation that has subversive purposes. Malign influence is too mild a term and is inaccurate. It's more akin to slander or to defamation. What may be a better choice is malicious, but a more accurate term would even be malignant, indicating the objective is to poison, disrupt, or even to demolish. Just had it moved out of my my screen. We need to convey this better through better use of terminology to use. I would call it subversive disinformation, because the goal is to subvert countries and societies in the interests of a foreign state actor. It's not so much a question, but I think it's an excellent point. Well, Anneli, since you didn't answer the last question, the terminology we're using is perhaps far too mild, insufficiently accurate.
Yes, and I think this is like one part that clearly where our future work should also focus on, and which is like an ongoing work that we are now doing more and more, because it will be relevant, for example, in regards of potential regulation of social media companies. What are we actually talking about when Facebook says that there is inauthentic coordinated behavior, what they mean by information operation for a foreign entity, and how does this all work together with our work, and how we define disinformation, misinformation, influence operations. There are so many different definitions to the problem that in a way then also lead us to a certain response, right? If we focus on disinformation, then we are mostly on the side that Keir just mentioned, on the media monitoring side, and then we might exclude some parts of the malign influence that are that should be there and are relevant. And on China, I'm by no means a China expert, but in a way, what is now like the situation where we are is that like by nature, Russia's and China's influence campaigns and operations have been different. But now what we see is that the first time China is engaging in very similar open disinformation messaging as Russia has been doing for years. And this, of course, needs to be countered, and this work needs to be taken forward.
Thanks. Tom, on the terminology?
Well, actually, on terminology, there's another bit of terminology that I might highlight some questions around, and that is the information war. We hear that a lot. So on one hand, this is a very serious conflict, so war seems to fit in many ways, but there are actually a couple downsides to it. First of all, war can imply that this is something that started at a certain moment and will end at a certain moment with somebody winning. It's more a chronic situation. It's more like the war on terror or the war on drugs than a kind of sudden kinetic war that begins and ends. And the other problem with war is that it implies a military response. So this would be saying that it's militaries, it's intelligence services, it's diplomatic services that need to conduct this war, while in fact the conflict, I think, is best fought at the level of civil society. Just a digression, but when we're talking about terminology.
Keir, it's unusual for you to be accused of being too mild in your language, but defend yourself.
Well, first of all, yes, Tom's absolutely right. We could go down an immensely deep rabbit hole if we look in the Russian concept of information warfare, information confrontation, differences between them, and how that reflects in the experience when you're on the receiving end of it. But Margarita's basic point is really important. Yes, the terminology matters. Now, here in this kind of informal, unstructured conversation, we can throw terms back and forth with relative freedom because we all know roughly what we're talking about. But yes, if you are actually planning specific responses and you are focusing your resources on dealing with specific problems, then the definitions become crucial. And whether you call it malign influence, malignant influence, probably not subversive disinformation, because as Anneli suggested, that limits the concept too much. The key thing is to have the agreed definitions. And we've seen how absolutely crucial that is from the horrible and bitter experience of fighting uphill over a course of many years against the concept of Russian hybrid warfare, which proliferated across NATO countries and had different meanings, even within different government departments in different countries, let alone not being harmonized across the continent as a whole. So yes, it's important, and yes, it's a foundational step for actually structuring a coordinated response.
Thanks, Keir. I mean, yes, it very much reminds me of, the way I was always taught about it, to think of this, is that information warfare is only 1/4 of the whole thing, really. And even then, information is combined with the cyber effects, but you also have to look at economic warfare, diplomatic, and of course, the kinetic warfare itself. And only then do you have a reasonably complete picture. Tom, I haven't come to you on this. Your turn.
No, you just did. I talked about war. And,
oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
all right. I was thinking on, a different thing.
That was my very memorable
okay,
comment.
I understand. Moving on to James. James Bergeron, that is, of NATO Maritime Command. Back to Russia and China. It's always relevant. I was interested in the idea, he says, that Russia and China are positioning themselves to take a leading role as stabilizers in a post-US world. How might that play out diplomatically and in terms of disinformation? We are seeing interesting, if subtle, Russian messaging against Assad and Haftar right now. That would support that claim to a mediating great power role for both of them, I suppose. Back to Keir.
That, of course, is not a new process. Russia wishes to position itself as being the responsible mediator, interposing itself in a conflict wherever it can in order to support this narrative that it does have a global role. And of course, in that, it does have one key advantage over most Western countries in that its suggestion that it is perfectly able to talk to all parties concerned is actually perfectly legitimate, not being constrained by values or relationships, and being able to pick and choose which aspects of which relationship you're going to cooperate on in a way that Western states can't. But this process, of course, eroding the authority of any other alternative center of power, a process that had started before but is now accelerated beyond recognition, means that when Russia needs to do this, or wishes to do that, China as well, it has that much less competition and that much less pushback and that many fewer alternatives for parties to conflicts, for example, if they are looking for a broker. So yes, this can be a key element of Russia regaining that position that it covets of being globally, if not respected, then at least taken account of. And as Russia says, there can be no global security situation that can be resolved without Russia's involvement. And they are that much further now to making that a reality instead of an aspiration.
Yes, I would say that we have erred in the past quite often in saying that Russia's goal in the information conflict is just to be a destroyer, to knock things down, that they don't offer anything. Keir is quite right that they are offering a role now for themselves as an international arbiter in many, many situations in their region and not. And then also they have been offering for some time a very distinct conservative, illiberal worldview, which to them is a positive, and to many people is a positive. I mean, to have Putin going around saying that he doesn't believe in multiculturalism, for example, or that to have Russia standing for conservative family values, or standing in solidarity with those who oppose immigration or those who oppose abortion, even though abortion is legal in Russia. They have been, when they evince these values, this is a positive narrative in the eyes of many people, just as well as their effort to become more of or portray themselves as more of a positive force diplomatically.
Thanks.
James, I'd just like to weigh in real briefly. The Bergeron's question, I saw it about Assad and Haftar, and basically, you know, the Russians are retrenching right now in Syria and in Libya, and basically they've learned that they can't bully the Turks. And I think that this is something where the Turkish drone warfare that they used in Idlib has really put the Russians on their back feet in Syria, and combined with COVID is really kind of, it's led to a new dynamic in regard to James's question in Syria and in Libya, especially where the GNA government is now on the offensive and Haftar's on the run. So
interesting. For what it's worth, I might slightly disagree. I kind of think that something's got to give, bearing in mind the massive economic calamity befalling Russia right now. And Ukraine is not going to be one of those things because it's so close to Russian, the Kremlin's what passes for a heart, perhaps. And therefore Syria may be one thing that they do withdraw from, maybe not in totality, but you may see a lessening. Venezuela as well, by the way. But interesting point to...
retrenching is what I was...
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Right, I'm going to move to Samantha de Bendern. I've not pronounced that correctly. De Bendern. Can we envisage widening the concept of disinformation and look at what could be called disingenuous actions? I like this. For instance, Russian aid to Italy, while doctors lack PPE while Russian doctors lack PPE even more than we do, has had a huge effect on perceptions of Russia positive, and the EU negative. Much of our thinking in combating disinformation is reactive, not proactive, just as the focus of many of our discussions are on identifying disinformation as opposed to what can be done to fight it. So, Samantha asks, should we perhaps be looking at ways to shape the overall narrative without even mentioning disinformation as a tool to combating it? Anneli.
So when it comes to EU's response against disinformation and how it started, is that this proactive communication is the priority. Just when it comes to our work, it's not branded. We are not promoting it as our team's work. That's why the EU versus Disinfo is something that is visible also for the Western audiences. But then what we do on proactive and strategic communication is branded as EU, as it should be, right? We are explaining people in these partnership countries what the EU is doing, what does it mean when EU supports the countries, how does it show in people's everyday lives. And this meant reforming, even revolutionizing EU's traditional communication, how it has functioned. I mean, I think that we can all be honest and agree that EU has not been the greatest communicator in the past. So this meant changing the ways how to change a normal press work that you do into communication campaigns. And this has shown results, and there is a yearly polling by European Commission done in the Eastern Partnership countries. And year by year, there is an increase in the amount of people who recognize the EU, who know what the EU is doing, and who also know about a specific project that EU is conducting in that country. So I think that is a very concrete example of the results of this work. But it's long-term hard work that we just need more of that, and it has to be. I also do think that it's very important that we keep that in these discussions about disinformation, because all of a sudden then when we only focus on disinformation, then maybe our response actually starts follow that line of thought. Thank you. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Keir.
What Sam's question really highlights is the gap in approaches between the two sides, where our adversaries are thinking about opportunities to increase their influence in order that they can position themselves for after this is over, whereas our side, generally speaking, is not. It may just be getting on with whatever it is trying to do without actually looking for ways in which this can be leveraged. And you have the classic examples of elements of strategic communications by action, like deliveries to Italy, like deliveries to the United States, to Serbia, etc., which then can play into a broader influence campaign. But take the flip side of that, and so much more that has been done with the EU, but not a peep on the strategic communication side, so people don't know it's happening. And also offering open goals to Russia, such as deliveries of PPE to countries that need it, which arrive on Russian aircraft because they are the cheapest ones to charter, and therefore Russia can claim, look, we're actually doing the delivering. And in this febrile environment of disinformation and counter-disinformation, they tend not to get contradicted. So it is simply a case of one side maximizing the opportunities that this presents, and the other side overlooking that altogether. And that really is a fundamental difference in the strategic communication approaches of the two sides. One side thinks that it is in an information war. The other side hasn't really noticed it's going on.
Yeah, while I've got you there, before I just turn this over to Tom, I do want the other participants, your panelists, to answer a question, but whilst I just got you there, I just want to ask you Hirotoshi Azuma's question, which is, which Russian intelligence agency is behind the dissemination of COVID-19 disinformation? And is there inter-service rivalry when doing this?
Again, that's something which people in our position can only speculate at, because the chain of command is going to be so well hidden, even when it actually exists in a rigid format. And there are plenty of arguments to say that no, the Russian disinformation machine is a self-perpetuating thing. You launch it, and then it's a self-licking lollipop, which it might actually be quite hard to direct. And this is why we see sort of random white noise coming out from which doesn't always fall in line with Russian state objectives. So it is an unknown, partly because we don't know we're not privy to those backroom conversations where Russia does outsource all of this activity to private enterprise or to organizations that are not related to the government, or in the case of cyber intervention to the criminal fraternity. We simply can't dig into that. All we can do is observe the symptoms and reach what we hope are reasonably well-founded conclusions about just how loose that structure is.
Thank you, Keir. You may relax because this is the last question. So I'll go back to Anneli and Tom in that order. Again, the previous question, should we be looking at ways to shape the overall narrative without even mentioning disinformation? Anneli.
I somehow thought that I already answered the question, but let me put it in other words. So yes, I definitely do think that your own communication efforts are as essential in response to disinformation and should be seen as part of that, so that you have the understanding of disinformation in the information environment and the impact of that. But what you do is your own communication as an organization, government, or an institution. Thank you.
Thanks. Tom, last comments on proactiveness.
Right. Well, going around the corridors of the EU, not in StratCom East, but the EU in general, and also the corridors of a number of European governments, EU members, it becomes obvious that everybody hates the idea of propaganda. And whenever you talk about, should Europe be more aggressive in telling its story, and should there be a voice of Europe, like Voice of America, and things like that, everybody's hair sort of stands on end, and they say, we don't do propaganda, we had terrible experiences with propaganda, and therefore, we don't do that. Well, okay, if you don't do that, there's going to be a cost. And if you look at the arrival of EU and Russian aid in Serbia, when the Russians sent in their plane, there were Russian flags all over and Serbian officials out there welcoming it, and bread and salt and, Bože, the whole thing. And if you look at the EU website, the Serbian delegation to the EU, what you see is a very generic picture of some EU aid arriving, no EU identification on the plane or on the boxes or anything. And incidentally, the plane was from Belarus. So, the EU is not telling a strong story. It's not promoting itself. When all this comes before St. Peter, he may say that you did the right thing, you were modest, and so you shall enter into heaven. But in the day-to-day information war, I think the EU and other Western countries have a long way to go in terms of promoting themselves.
Thanks, Tom. Ladies and gents, time flies when you're discussing disinformation, and tremendous apologies to, we had so many questions left. I don't think, just for once, it was particularly bad chairing. It's really a reflection of the numbers of you online and of the tremendous interest. And I can't help but feeling, as I hand over to Glenn, just to say a few closing words, apart from thanks, Glenn and Jamestown, but we could almost run this whole thing again and could just go through the rest of the questions. It's been, I feel, unfulfilled despite the excellence of the last 90 minutes. So my personal thanks to all three panelists, and over to you, Glenn.
Thank you very much, James. I think the high number of over 300 participants today online has really said a lot. I'm a firm believer that there's strength in numbers, and when we do force multiplication like this, working with Chatham House, it's a great privilege to extend the message and help broaden the understanding in the community about this important issue. And also because Jamestown has been recently listed as an undesirable organization by the Russian Federation, and not once, but for the third time.
Yes.
We also appreciate you willing to work with an undesirable organization like ourselves.
Anytime.
So anyway, thank you, everyone. It's been a great privilege for joining us today. And so, James,
thank you, and thank you to Anna and John Folks at Chatham House and Jamestown for organizing. All the best, everybody.